afternoon. I was here last afternoon and I felt incredibly weighed down by the density of the two talks, and I can imagine that today would have been no different. So I really appreciate that you're here for what is, I think, a shorter session. So I think we have an hour and a half, and the way we have planned this is that I'll aim for about 45 minutes, or maybe even less, and we'll take questions and discuss soon after that. Arjun just mentioned that the session is different in many ways, and in one important way, which is that I'm not an economist by training. I did a BA, just sort of broad spectrum BA, which had an economics course or a couple of courses, but I wouldn't put myself out as an economist in any sense. What we learned there was pretty modest. But what I've done subsequently is that I've tried to work with the literature as much, almost like sort of a novitiate. You start with the basics and try and work with the literature, and with a certain part of that literature, the part that deals with law and legal institutions. So ordinarily, a lecture or a session that I did in a classroom would be more oriented towards dealing with law and politics, which are the core areas that I work in. In a session like this, I'm not claiming that I'll do the economics as such, but as the two readings that I've set out for the session indicate, I'm trying to piece in for you what the economics literature on this important question says, and how it relates to the questions that I deal with today. And the main question that I deal with is, what is the place of law in the development debate in India? I say in India, but none of the two readings that I've sent out are both deal with law and development in America and in Europe. They talk about the third world, but they're situated in those disciplinary frames. So my only claim to asking this question in the Indian context is to really bring to you some of the work that we are doing, and by example, try and extrapolate these concerns and see where it fits in the Indian debates. So the two readings that I sent out, and I'll just briefly take you through. I don't know, I noticed you have a busy day, and I don't know how much of you are managing to get through the readings as well. But the two readings that I sent out to you were one by Kenneth Dam called The Law Growth Nexus, which is published a few years ago, which is considered one of the main books defining the field of law and development today. And I sent you the second chapter in that book. And the second piece of reading, the second reading that I sent out was Davis and Treblecock, which is in the American Journal of Comparative Law, which criticizes the Dam position and looks at, it's a broad survey piece on where law and development has gone as a subfield over the last 30 years, right? So these are the two pieces that I have sent out for you. The Kenneth Dam piece focuses on law and finance literature, which I'll say a little bit about. And I'm not really going to take you through these pieces so much as I'll try and say something interesting about them as I go along, and leave you to piece the rest together. So the central question that the law and development literature has to deal with is whether law is necessary to the project of development, to put the question squarely. And the two readings take opposite views. Dam suggests that law is necessary, and that on balance, the economic evidence suggests that controlling for every other factor, that law makes a positive contribution to the development process by itself. The second piece challenges that claim. The literature that they're surveying is similar, and I'll take you through it briefly to the extent that I understand it. But the place I want to start is where the development debate in India is at, and the place of law in the Indian development debate. So if those of you are familiar with the Lokpal movement, which raged through most of last year, had as its singular focus the creation of the legislation into being of a new institution. Now, notice that the core of the solution to what is a very wide and pressing problem is legislation, that is petitioning Parliament to pass some set of norms which arguably, at least as the protagonist would have it, will shape the behavior of the state, a whole range of actors, behavior of state officials, as well as the expectations of the general population of the country. And what would do this, leaving all things aside, a legislation was capable of doing this kind of, being this kind of transformative artifact. So our own work on corruption institutions of the Lokpal variety, and we looked at the Lok Ayukta institution in Karnataka, which is taken to be the best of the anti-corruption institutions. The best Lok Ayukta in the country has performs at a level lower than the average police station and the average prosecution system of a home department in the worst states of the country. So you would find a prosecution rate of less than 5%. And the average national rate for an offense like theft, ordinary theft, was corruption, which had very little hope of success. Even the strongest Lokpal institution, however you corrected you gave it more investigative powers and you gave it this and that, it had almost no chance of success. And the reason it had no chance of success was in some ways external to the Lok Ayukta institution. It was the structure of the legal system itself. That is, the institutional structure of the legal system and the criminal justice system in particular gave this kind of policy choice almost no chance of success because of various other issues which we are studying separately. But you can imagine why the legal system is in many ways immune to change and immune to securing these kinds of outcomes. I won't try and explain why that is the case. Let's look at something quite different from the Lokpal and a different kind of what would be taken to be a development problem. Let's take entitlement-based welfare rights, which is in some ways new welfare. And let's take an example, in this case, the right to education legislation. So the right to education legislation creates for the first time in national law, in union law, the entitlement to secure free and compulsory is not an entitlement, free education of a certain description as set out in the Act. As many of you would be familiar, the legislation was passed a few years ago. It survived a high-profile constitutional challenge. In some ways, what the RTE was to India was quite similar to what the healthcare law was to the US. In that, the healthcare law stands for a range, it stands to define a constitutional relationship between the state and a sector of human activity. In that way, the RTE also defines that relationship because it imposes new obligations on private actors, which is a new dimension to thinking about welfare in India. Now, most people would, and most people who were engaged in that high-profile litigation, including ourselves, would believe that this is a very significant development which has serious consequences for social welfare in the future. Having said that, once you get into the sort of the less dramatic and the more visceral in some ways parts of implementing this legislation, what it would take is a range of other institutional supports that can make RTE implementation possible. It requires a bureaucracy of a certain sort, but it also requires the capacity to enforce the legislation through what is the child protection officers and at a later stage the courts, right? So if in the event, two things can happen with the RTE legislation. Nothing may change, That is that we have a new legislation, we have a new device of legal entitlements, but nothing may change, or a significant amount of in the delivery of education may change if we look at it, say 10 or 15 years from now. If either of these, if we were to understand the possibility that either of these outcomes are possible today, what might tilt the possibilities one way or the other is a question that we might ask. In these debates, notably, law, legal design, and attention to legal systems, legal system reform is completely absent. And in the intellectual history of thinking about the development process in India, law is both institutionally and intellectually removed from the debate. For those of you who have a sense of that debate in the 1950s, even before the Constituent Assembly was dissolved, that's the first parliament, there were serious challenges to the government's efforts at land reform and at regulation of free speech. Nehru, when all of these challenges were struck down in the court, Nehru pointedly remarked that lawyers have purloined the Constitution. That was just before the Constitution got off the ground. Many people tend to stress that as several of the political figures in the Constituent Assembly and prime ministers and ministers were all lawyers, that somehow lawyers had a sort of strong influence on the early intellectual history of India. But in the development debate, it was very clear, even as early as the 50s, that the thing to be done is that lawyers should be kept quite far away from these questions. And it was very clear in the early years of the Republic that whether it was the way academic institutions were funded or supported, or the way legal academics or others were allowed to participate in the formulation of policy and in key institutions, they were all marked by their absence. They were not there. And all along, the perception that law is either irrelevant to, or certainly the difficult, thorny part, the difficult part, the one that we should do away with to the development process, has been a dominant stream. If you do a careful secondary literature search on law and development in India, you'll be struck that there is not a single book. And in the article, in journal articles, there's just one article by Upendra Bakshi in 1972 in an obscure Swedish institutional, sort of a grey publication, as you would call it, like a pamphlet in 1972 called Law and Development in India. And that is the only published work. So if you look at the last 60 years of engagement, 60 plus years of engagement with this issue, you're struck by the fact that no one has done any work on it. And this has not been seen to be central to the issues of development in the country. Having said that, notice that I started with two examples where some of the most prominent development debates of our time seem to centrally turn on whether we have the appropriate legal institutions and the legal processes to secure these outcomes. At least in popular discourse, we seem to believe that law is central to the capacity to secure these outcomes, these welfare development outcomes. So in some ways, the way I see it, as someone who's trying to deal with this area both in a practical and intellectual sense, is that we have a lot of work to do to try and understand our current circumstances and think through them in more theoretical ways. And that's what I propose to do with you for the next 20 minutes. And what I'll do is I'll really try and engage with this debate in a broad sense. I don't have a paper as such, and I'm not like advocating a strong position today. Today is as much exploratory for me as it may be for you. I don't know how many of you are law and economics specialists. I certainly am not. So I hope that sense of exploration is mutual. So come back to the main question. What is the place of law in securing development outcomes? Is it irrelevant? B, relevant but not significant, and C, necessary to secure reasonable development outcomes. I think as a first stop, you might ask me, you need to say a little bit about what development means. And the two pieces that I have for you take very different views of what development outcomes one seeks to secure. So let me start with the Kenneth Dam piece on law and finance. And he makes it very clear that he's concerned with a model of development which is conventional economic development. Per capita income, gross domestic product, that kind of measurement. And in that debate, he says that the central question that all law and economics scholars have been dealing with, one of the central questions, is the problem of legal origin. And he tries and explains that problem of legal origin. And it seems to emerge from a literature that is looking at law and finance, as it's called, looking at credit markets and equity markets, and trying to understand whether credit markets and equity markets in 49 countries are, if you compare the origins of their legal system, whether there are certain causal factors emerging from the origin of the legal system on the outcomes in per capita GDP and per capita income as well as GDP in these 49 countries. And that literature is 90s, in the mid 90s, 95 to about 2001. And what the literature suggests is that, or at least the authors argue, is that there is causation. And for some of you, actually the part that I understand best, and maybe some of you may not understand as well, is the modeling of the two systems. What they do is that, in a bit of a caricature, model all legal systems as having 2 points of origin: the French Civil Code from the 1800s and the English common law system, and then through historical mapping try to suggest that all legal systems all over the world either draw from the French Civil Code or the English common law system. That's what they mean by legal origins. So the legal origins hypothesis is that if you draw from the English common law system, the outcomes in terms of per capita and GDP growth will be better than if you draw from the French system. And they try to show this over a 200-year period, right? Because that's, in a sense, the colonial legal systems period. And they show that because, in a sense, the distribution of legal systems is a function of colonialism. It's not in some ways otherwise determined. It's an accidental distribution. So if you take these 49 countries, then it should form a reasonable sample from which to make such a claim, is what the literature suggests. So here, the argument is that if you have a common law system, it will make for better development outcomes. Now, there is no explanation of why common law systems make for better development outcomes. There is some speculation in the literature. They say things like allowing judges, maybe it is intrinsic to the common law system, that judges who reason from case to case, iteratively, one case at a time, sort of, that kind of reasoning results in better outcomes. But that is not what is demonstrated by the literature. What is demonstrated is only the broad claim. Now, for a lawyer reading this kind of material, one is struck by a few things, and I'll try and point them out in a serial fashion. Some of this criticism is in the literature, but it strikes one as one reads these pieces. The first is that the idea that two areas of law, say credit and equity markets, are somehow capture the essence of a legal system. It is common for people to stress other areas of law. For example, the stability of political institutions, democracy, freedom of the press, as being somehow causative of development, or at least strongly correlated with development outcomes. But it's it's striking in this piece that the four economists choose a very narrow and hyper-technical area of law and suggest that this area of law is best correlated to these outcomes. It may be that, and the authors try to explain that credit markets and equity markets have all these other spillovers in the way an economy functions, and hence the choice of these areas of law are the best indicators of development outcomes. The second thing that is striking, that the first is just the choice of a very narrow area of law, substantive law. And you might ask, which area of law should we look for when we understand these systems? The second area that one is struck by is the concern with substantive law, which is that just assume for a moment that we all incorporate the substantive law of the City of London on securities and credit into India, right? And we legislate these laws into being. Will that have certain outcomes based on, as this correlation suggests? And what's missing here is some account of the legal system and the relationship of formal legal norms with other social norms. That unless you have some account of whether a legal system enforces these norms at all, and B, whether these legal system norms have an overbearing influence on the way people act, it actually shapes behavior. Because behavior might be shaped by a range of other informal arrangements that have nothing to do with law, right? And this is not just hypothetical, it's often the case. So it's not clear that even if you show this kind of correlation at a substantive law level, that the conclusions follow. The Kenneth Dam article goes much further than this. It argues that the idea that the way that the countries were coded as common law and civil law systems is itself doubtful as an empirical matter, and secondly that the areas. The second point that he makes. So one is the coding point. And there's a second point which is not coming to my mind immediately, but you can pick that up in the literature. What you get generally is that the law and finance literature, the early legal origins arguments for law and development seem to be overblown by a significant measure as being in any way authoritative for the claim that a better substantive law system will lead to better development outcomes. What is striking is that literature spawned a cottage industry of development aid, which was about transplanting particular formats for legal regulation into the developing world. And the choice of equity markets and credit markets is not accidental, because if you look at the funding of the bank and the IMF in the structural adjustment programs, all of them were oriented towards dealing with these two issues, equity markets and insolvency. And in some sense, that literature was I don't know how these things happen, and I don't know this intellectual history well enough, but it coincidentally emerged at the same time. And so that area of development aid and that area of law and economics theory has in some ways crashed and burned, because those outcomes with the 90s transfers, and you know that in India we adopted the same regulatory model with the creation of a stock exchange board and its adoption of British and American practices of regulation, that we did much the same. Our stock markets haven't, just taken by itself, haven't done too badly, but I think that this taken on a wider spread have not worked out quite like the way the authors predicted. The second way of looking at this is to say that this law and finance literature is too taking law by itself is a mistake. And the way that one should approach this question is to see it as a governance question. And so this literature emerges 10 years after the law and finance literature at the sort of 2000 and thereafter, 2004 really, with the Kaufman and the World Bank team doing governance analysis, and followed up by Danny Roderick and others who have taken this stream of analysis further. What is this literature arguing, and how does it go beyond the law and finance literature? The first thing it does is it abandons the origins hypothesis. So the origins hypothesis seems to have only one sort of key analytical virtue, was that causation was linear. That origin happened 2 years ago and you're looking at development now. So you couldn't say that the development caused the origin, right? So, but what the governance literature does is it introduces a wider array of calculations, of which rule of law and legal systems is one element of this of measurement. The others include voice and accountability, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but it has six ingredients, and which come together with a particular set of weights to form a governance measure for each country. And the argument again in the Roderick and Kaufman literature is that governance is a sure predictor of the levels of governance are very strong predictors of development outcomes. That is, if you're able to improve these governance parameters taken by itself, the development outcomes would be there to see. Now, this literature has a significant array of criticism. I want to focus on only one part, which is the rule of law indicator. So the rule of law indicator has a virtue that the early law and finance literature does not have, in that it takes a wider range of ingredients of a legal system than just legal origin or than just insolvency and credit markets. For example, it looks at, so one of the famous things that are trotted out by our press significantly is, it looks at regulatory effects, which is simply how many, what is the range of regulatory burdens that any activity takes. And the activity could be, they focus way too much on business, but the activity could just be an informal hawker stand. It could be there as well. And they try to measure, as a matter of survey evidence, what that is comparative across 200 countries. So 49 versus 200 countries, so that's much larger database. The other is that it looks at a range of effects. It also looks at the legal system generally. This was something that was missed out in the early law and economics literature, which is that no matter what your substantive entitlements are, it doesn't matter unless the legal system enforces those entitlements, unless it's reasonably plausible that you can secure those outcomes. And so here in the governance literature, the rule of law variable measures enforcement through the civil court system and through the criminal court system in significant amounts of detail. What it does not do, and what I think in some ways the deep criticism comes from, is from its inability to parse out the relationship between legal systems and non-legal forms, or I'll just call them social forms of norm creation and norm enforcement. So, and here the really interesting piece is not a piece in response to Roderick and the Kaufman literature, but one written way back in 1972, which is referred to in the piece, and which is why I put this second piece in your readings, which is written by two scholars talking about an estrangement with the law and development movement in the United States. And they stress at that point a problem that they see to be endemic in development theory, which is equated with modernization. And the point they stress is that what you find in a modernization theory model is that you're looking to replicate a certain set of cultural and institutional parameters in a society, and you're trying to show that if you are able to do this, certain range of development outcomes are possible. And what they rely on, and this is Galanter, the piece that's in your reading, the reference is Galanter. What the Galanter literature shows, and it's interesting that the literature is not focused on the developing world, it's focused on America and tort law. And it looks at why in the American legal system, substantive entitlements which were meant to deliver benefits to tort law claimants repeatedly in a legal system which is ostensibly fair, repeatedly failed to do so. So they looked at the substantive tort law which was biased in some ways to claimants for tort law damages, whether they be of negligence or of nuisance, with the two most common forms of corporate torts. And they found that if you looked at literature, looked at case law over a 20-year period, that even with a rule of law legal system and with the substantive law that created these entitlements, that these outcomes were not secured. And this is in a piece called Why the Haves Come Out Ahead, and has defined this area of thinking about law, at least in an empirical sense. What this literature shows is that the primary determinant of outcomes, it seems, is not in a narrow sense just the legal system formats and the substantive legal norms, and that unless you are able to piece together in a richer, sort of a thick ethnographic sense, the alignment of other social norms and other social actors and players together with these formal legal systems, one could never work out these relationships and these outcomes. Now this is not and this was pitched as a general criticism of modernization theory. So this is not specific to legal systems, right? You could say this of many other social phenomena, that if you studied them in only using narrow formal terms, that you would be unable to capture unable to capture or explain why these outcomes took place. And it seems that very early in the legal literature, not the law and economics literature, but in the legal literature, this idea was quite strongly understood. Now, the law and economics literature, if you look at the recent publications in the last 2 or 3 years, is now grappling with this problem in the Danny Roderick, Kaufman kind of matrix, which is that even if you use a wider measure of governance as an index to measure a range of institutional qualities, that you still would not make robust findings on outcomes because of this range of other informal mechanisms that actually sustain and secure these outcomes, make these outcomes possible. It has been suggested that the new institutional economics frameworks, at least as defined and thought through by North, anticipate institutions precisely in this wider sense of institutions as rules and not merely organizations, and institutions as rules being this range of normative frames. But for, I think, various reasons, maybe primarily of the difficulty of measurement, dealing with the core normative range of social phenomena is somehow very difficult for conventional economists to do, and hence the law and development literature still sits on that very difficult problem that while you can do this formal measurement and kind of emphasize the role of law and legal systems, it still doesn't quite get to the core of the problem of locating the place of law. You may, and people like me who are just starting off and working with this literature, we might be more enthusiastic than many others trying to say that, we can, that focusing on formal legal institutions can have dramatic impacts on development outcomes. But it seems that the weight of the literature as I see it suggests otherwise. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello, sir. My name is Aswat Mishra. I am from IIT Kharagpur. So just thinking about how does the existing laws lead to development. Specifically one, when our country still follows the most nefarious British legacies, the Indian Forest Act 1927, the Land Acquisition Act 1884, amended 1984. Second, enforcement of law, to put it mildly, has been pathetic. The fifth schedule of the Constitution, which says that the governor, on the advice of the tribal council, can repeal the Land Acquisition or the Indian Forest Act. But what happens is that this has never happened in case of India, whether it's Odisha, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, any state. We have the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act 1996, which says that the state cannot occupy tribal land without the consent of the panchayat. But what happens in Nuaga, where POSCO project is coming up, is the police personnel with loaded guns threateningly barricade the panchayat meetings.
How do we do this? Will we take a few? I think I'll take a few.
Okay, so we take a few questions in there's one down here. Down here.
Hello?
Yeah.
It's fine?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm Akanksha. I'm from Indian Statistical Institute, Delhi. And I would like to ask this question that you suggested that we should take into account regulatory effects as measure for governance, which in turn will tell that whether these laws are fine or not up to the mark. But all I was thinking about was that it's hard to get these effects as in empirical sense, as in the empirical evidences. So which would make it very difficult for us to measure it. So I think there's more need to look into the literature of what we can actually do, and it would be great if you suggest.
Follow-ups to that, or should we go to the first two questions
Your first point to be two things. One is the origin of the laws, and so some burden, at least of all the literature I presented today, I think that the legal origins argument is one that we should put to rest. There are good laws and bad laws of various sorts, but this sort of idea that a certain origin of a legal system is somehow either we are condemned because it's a terrible legal system, or that we are liberated because we've been bequeathed with the right legal system, is one that we should quietly put to rest. Having said that, you can argue, like you have, that the Forest Act, though the Forest Act is now changed and amended, you can well point out that the forest laws were drafted at a certain period to serve a certain purpose of colonial forestry, and that it has changed now. Now my question, I think the more interesting question, the way I saw your intervention, was now that they have changed, what has that changed on the ground? And I would go with that to the second issue that you raise, is that the very example that you raised, the Panchayat extension to scheduled areas or the administration of fifth schedule areas, suggests that if we stay, how do I put it? Let's say we were doing this general bird's eye level economic survey and just looking at the substantive entitlements. These legislations look pretty revolutionary. Fifth schedule is something that, and I do this, this is my bread and butter, so fifth schedule is revolutionary, right? I don't know of any other constitution which carves out a territorial zone to which the general federal power does not apply. I have not seen another carve out like that. So that looks like revolutionary stuff as far as legal form goes. And I think that some of the burden of what I've been trying to say is that the difficulty with empirical measurement in this field is that if we stay with the question of form, we don't get the story in just the way that you suggested, which is that it's sort of the coalescing of other institutional forms and other social mobilizations that actually translates into outcomes. You might, there is this development literature that talks about weak states and strong states, and the problem with India is that it's a weak state and the state is unable to translate its will and so on and so forth. And I think that's somehow just so thin. I mean, one doesn't say it's disagreeable. You can say that India is a weak state, and that's quite agreeable, and the evidence suggests that. But in terms of an explanatory understanding of the place of law in the development process, for me, the key caution I take away is that if we stay with the legal form, with just the legal form and legal institutions, we won't be able to tell the story of development. If the development outcomes have to happen, they have to happen for a range of other non-legal alignments that will make the law work, right? And so that's what I take from you. I don't find anything that you said untrue or wrong, but theoretically, the way I understand it is that that we should avoid, that we being economists and lawyers, both lawyers have also a strong we're strongly tethered to form, doctrinal form as being our primary mode of analysis. So for both lawyers and economists, abstracting away from that form is very, very important, is what I would take away from it. So your comment on regulatory effects, so I'm not saying that one should go about measuring regulatory effects, though I'll tell you a little bit about the Roderick-Kaufman measurement. One of the strongest criticisms of their study is the form of the survey. The way they measured regulatory effects is by administering a survey to a range of stakeholders, business owners, judges, regulatory officials, and others, or something like that. So they have a form that they administer. And what you see, I completely with you, that measuring regulatory effects empirically is quite difficult. This is the way it's done in the Kaufman study. We haven't done in the APU anything close to that. So I'm with you that measuring these kinds of things are difficult, but I don't have any, I don't have enough of sort of grounding in the empirical question to be able to suggest which is the best way to do it.
Kish from BHU. So you, in your total presentation, you use the word entitlement a lot of time. Is there any difference between the entitlement and rights? And my second question is that, are law is lost source of entitlements?
Sorry, what is that?
Law is the only one source of entitlements.
Agree so much with the position that you've taken that I find it hard to bring myself to raise a point of objection or skepticism at the same time. Well, if you go to the classic case of the dispute over maternity, the two would-be claimant mothers go to King Solomon precisely because they cannot resolve their difference of views. There's a conflict there. So it seems law comes in precisely when society fails to be self-governing in some deeper sense through its, let's say, autonomous behaviors, institutions, and so on, other than legal institutions. Because law is distinguished above all by coercive enforcement powers of the state. And I think there are two kinds of conflicts in general that one can think of in society. One is the prisoner's dilemma type of conflict, war of all against all. The other is class conflict. So in addition to the difficulties you have raised with the literature, particularly the economistic literature, and economists are like those people who have lost their keys and they always look for the key under the light. Because they are idiots of measurability, you see. So on that count, I should like to raise the following question. It seems that a lot of this literature assumes development means economic growth of GDP. But why should that be? What about the quality of life? We were talking about our cities. You know, I'm sorry to say this, but our cities are going to hell. In fact, I think Jayati Ghosh used that word this afternoon. So what about the quality of life? What about the distributive outcomes and so on? So if you take a more nuanced, more relevant view of the outcomes themselves, I think the economists would be all at sea in trying to establish the worth of the law. But having said all of that, let me raise my point of skepticism, which is that I think sometimes legislation can have an announcement effect, can have the effect of providing a gravitational pole around which people's conflicting beliefs might begin to coalesce. And that might begin to resolve conflict without using the big stick of the law. Perversely, a legal enactment might serve to reduce the need for state coercion and so on. Okay, so that's my main point. A slightly subsidiary point is about your point on Lokpal and Lokayukt experiences on the ground. I think I'm not sure if I'm right about this, but I think, aren't we comparing apples and oranges? Because Lokayukt, Lokpal situations are typically white-collar crimes. Whereas when you talked about, even in the systems of law, even the worst of our states delivering justice in the case of theft, typically a blue-collar crime, I think it's well understood that these are very difficult to compare, because information is much more recondite, hidden, easy to conceal in white-collar crimes than in blue-collar crimes.
We take one more question and then maybe you can answer them in a group. And then
Probably covered in the earlier question, but I'll still say that. It's a bit of a clarification. When you said regulatory impact or effect of the law, okay, regulatory, I mean, I'm not a law person, I don't understand anything about it, so this is a clarification for me. Regulatory can be, something that says something is not to be done, and we are going to control, not allow you to do something which harms other people, for example, okay? You can't steal people's money, or you can't murder somebody, or whatever it is. There is another kind of regulatory, I suppose, which also talks about rights. So regulatory in the sense of enabling, which would sort of ensure that a person has I don't know, standard of living or dignity or whatever. So I would like to distinguish between these two types of laws or regulatory mechanisms or whatever. And I would like to know where you think both these types sort of link into development. And by development, I'm not just talking about GDP, I'm also talking about human development, indices, or whatever other measures we want to use. Is there any distinction, or would they both act in the same way?
Yeah. Shall I? Yeah. So the first question was the rights entitlements distinction. Lawyers would technically say that entitlements can be of various sorts, and rights are a crystallized form of entitlement which imposes duties on others. There might be entitlements which may not impose duties on others. That's a technical, lawyerly distinction. But I think that the sort of prevalence of entitlements language is a function of an economist, Amartya Sen. I don't know if you consider him an economist / political philosopher, because he, in his capability theory, used the language of entitlements. And once he did that, yeah. So in that tradition, I wouldn't say that Nozick and they were probably both at Harvard, but I don't know if they make a single tradition. But in that use of language, they speak of entitlements. So economists use the language of entitlements, but entitlements, I would say, is a wider set, and rights are a smaller set, which is crystallized entitlements that impose duties on others. So we have all sorts of entitlements. I may think I have an entitlement to fresh air in a city, but may not be crystallized in a way that it imposes concrete obligations on others. So I don't have a right to fresh air. I'm just using a hypothetical example. You know? So I guess that's the point of distinction. Okay, so a range of questions that Mohan raised, and I'll try and respond. Actually, Mohan moves into territory that I'm more comfortable with. So the way that we think as lawyers and people who do philosophical work in the law, we think like this about law. What are the social functions of law, we ask, right? And what kinds of problems can it resolve, and what can it not resolve? And so we would say things like coordination problems are the kinds of problems that most legal systems should be able to resolve. And I want to start at this end, because you raised a question of cities. I'm sorry I missed Jayati Ghosh's presentation. I thought that I have to work through this burdensome economics literature, and I stayed out of the class. But what I make of that is that in some ways, pollution type and traffic type problems, if you just take two, in many ways they're coordination problems. And if you look at the strength of a legal system, usually it resolves coordination problems slightly better than distributive problems of the other sort that you asked. Because distributive problems, someone has got to give up. And that, for a legal system to have traction on a society, to be able to solve distributive problems, means that you have a stronger legal system. But look at our current predicament. We are not able to solve coordination problems. So and it's strange that in our sort of popular political discourse and even movement discourse on law, the legitimacy that we owe to law does not even extend to the coordination problem resolution. Because
Yes, it's very difficult to separate the coordination part from the distributive part. For example, if you had a Singapore-type tax on cars, cars are very expensive in
yes.
Singapore because the government taxes the daylights out of the car. A $15,000 car in Boston will cost you $50,000 in Singapore. Now, if you consider that to be a coordinated piece,
no,
simultaneously it's taxing the upper middle class.
I see that Singapore as a classic sort of view that that takes a distributive approach, right? It imposes burdens, it benefits some and distributes, and that means that only strong states can do that. In some ways, classically a lawyer would say that for a legal system to be able to solve it like that, it has to be a pretty robust legal system. But to solve it using a simple traffic rules formulation is a simpler coordination response, and usually legal systems should be legitimate enough to do that at least in an uncomplicated way. But the way our current situation is far removed from even that. We are not even at a stage where we think our legal system can solve pure coordination problems, which have minimal distributive impacts. So your question was that yes, law has to solve a range of other situations, whether you describe them as a prisoner's dilemma kind of game problem or a class conflict distribution problem. And the capacity for law to solve this range of problems as a imagination, in legal philosophical terms, we can imagine that law can solve these problems. They're not irresolvable in that sense. And we can have normative formulae to do this. But for a legal system to be able to do this in a sustainable and consistent way takes a significantly, let's just say, different legal system from where we are. But I thought the question that you were pointing to is the wider range of considerations that should come into the term development. And frankly, lawyers are not used to having a GDP metric imposed on a quality of our system. The way we generally measure is the rights questions, right? Do you have the general measurement of a legal system would be, does the legal system assure security of your possessions, and does it lead to a sort of an overall, people are satisfied with the legal system. They feel safe and secure, and they feel that whenever they're treated unjustly, that the law will remedy that treatment. So that's usually the measure. So that's why when I point to this 97 onwards literature, the law and finance literature, it's imposing a very different range of considerations as to what is effective law or an effective legal system. It's that's why, I mean, for a conventionally trained lawyer like me, these are new things. These are new measurements.
These are guys who say essentially rule of law means rule of property.
Property and enforcement of contracts. And if you look at the Kenneth Dam piece, he's very clear that it means for me, there's a token consolation in, I think, maybe your third page, which says development can mean lot of things. It can mean human rights, it can mean all these things, but I don't want to go there because I can talk about these three limited things and these are measurable. And what are those three limited things? The enforcement of property rights, the enforcement of contracts, and a functioning judicial system. And so these are the three measures of development. And these are, the functioning of a judicial system is a conventional legal measure. Lawyers are also into measuring the efficacy of a legal system. But the enforcement of property rights and contractual rights as being the key measures of a legal system are relatively new. At the 2 decades old as being the Sharpe index. And so our conventional way of thinking about this problem is not to think like this. But this, in an institutional sense, is a very powerful way because Roderick and Kaufman is in the bank, and I think Roderick, half of the bank and the fund, and I don't know, the whole international aid industry are very responsive to this literature. And so this literature is hugely influential and has to be responded to. Your other question was, let's keep empirical effects aside for now, and let's look at, I'm just going to call them symbolic effects because that's how the literature deals with them. And that's no doubt true that one of the most important functions of law is its expressive function. So when a statute says that a caste slur is illegal, it may not mean that tomorrow everyone stops using the caste slur. But the expressive effect of law is that it coalesces social opinion around a normative view of the world. And so anyone who still uses a caste slur at least has the sort of normative overhang that they think that may not be the best thing to do, even though they are not getting prosecuted or successfully prosecuted. And lawyers are very familiar and responsive to symbolic effects. And we think that, it's interesting, Kenneth Dam says something interesting about legal origins literature. He says that it takes 2 generations in an independent post-colonial country to change any area of law. So he says, even if you put new securities law, it will take 2 generations of bureaucrats, administrators, judges, lawyers, business people to even entrench that normative form. Till then, it's a symbolic effect. Or it is a nominal effect, at least for that initial 30 or 35 years. But to take such a deeply social view, sort of a deep view of a legal system will mean that we have to have a different range of expectations of the ways in which legal reform takes place, or the ways in which at least legal reform is connected to social reform. You have to give that kind of latitude and say that this still has meaning in its expressive sense. So the Lokpal Lokayukta, I think that's a good question, except that I would say 2 things. One is that, and I'll make 2 different points. So let's look at cases where the Lokayukta trapped the officials. Okay, so you just taking your example that evidence might be a problem in white collar crimes. Trap cases are those cases where the Lokayuktas caught you with the money. So they have either filmed you or they have given you cash which is laced with a marker and the cash is in your hand and they've caught you with the money. Even in those cases, the prosecution rate is extremely low. And that's difficult to explain as an evidential problem. The other thing is that if we compare with other economic crimes, which is why I never compared with murder. If you compare with physical crimes, murder and grievous hurt, then I take your point that it's blue collar and white collar kind of distinction, and that might be much stronger. Now, we don't have disaggregated data on the number of theft cases that are petty theft and large theft, so we can't tell that question. But I suspect that what's at work here is something I don't think that this is only a white collar problem, though that can be important. My sense is there's something else about just the core of this, the way anti-corruption. So let me put it in a slightly different way. If you look worldwide, let's forget about India for a moment. Anti-corruption agencies that pursue criminal prosecution have an extremely low prosecution rate, even in countries with otherwise reasonably well-functioning legal systems. So you have a problem there, and I think the range of policy choices that you bring to corruption, we have to understand corruption better, and whether criminal prosecution has a chance at all of succeeding in an area like this is the way I would look at that question. So the last question was about regulatory effects. So just to be clear, I'm not saying that one must study regulatory effects. I'm just saying that this is being studied in great detail. So the classic example of regulatory effects is the doing business reports. So what they study here is what is the range of impediments or regulatory hurdles to incorporating a business or to opening a shop in India, Cambodia, and Ghana. And they compared the three countries and try and, in that comparative scale, establish why one model of regulation is better or worse than another. So this is the focus of the report. So your question was, you don't know what they're studying, so this is what they're studying mostly. And your second point was that there's a distinction between regulation that is about granting rights and so on and so forth, and regulation that is regulation of business in this sense. So in the Kaufman matrix, this does not count as regulatory effects. So that he measures in some other way on a range of entitlements. Sorry for the language, it's not mine. They call it entitlements. The range of entitlements is measured separately in the rule of law index. It's not in the regulatory effects.
So regulatory means by definition that you are causing some kind of obstacles or rules about what should not be done.
Yeah, I don't know. There might be an economic theory reason for why that is called regulatory and rights are not called regulatory, but I don't.
I mean, this is how it's defined in economics. So I'm just trying to understand how it's.
So that has been transposed to the legal measurement. In this case, they're measuring using those frameworks.
So we have Namrata, Uma, then Vamsi, then we have another third following up. So,
Lata from Center for Development Studies. My question is, I'd like to know the ways in which institutions, whether it's like formal or informal, what effect does it have on the decision-making behavior of individuals, and what is its impact on the developmental outcomes? That's the thing that I'd like to.
This is Uma from Center for Development Studies. Taking a little bit further ahead of Namrata's question. So as we know, it's like legal institutions supposed to reduce the transaction cost of the procedure. It's like, suppose in India, if you are going for the history, we know that it takes a lot of years to get the judgment. So it affects the transaction cost of the individual to go for the any kind of case. So how that transaction cost affects the developmental outcomes?
No, I just want to go back to the first question that was raised. See, there is a bit of a puzzle, that I'm trying to think through, and I want, at least an initial answer from the law and development kind of perspective. See, if you look at the, yesterday Aditya and Prabhat, they laid out a very clear framework of primitive accumulation. Accumulation by encroachment or by disposition, whatever you want to call it. That's the broad context in which development is happening in the last 20 years. But if you go to tribal areas, this is not just in the last 20 years. I think it goes back, much further. The puzzle is, you look at the legal form, right? We already talked about it. You have Schedule 5, you have PISA Act, you have Forest Rights Act, 2006, the latest Forest Rights Act. you have, Act 1 of 1970, really powerful legislation, right, which tries to ensure the sovereignty of the tribal communities. And then, if you look at the forms of resistance that have emerged, it's not as if people have been silent. Different groups have been resisting. And there is an intermediary layer, people like you or people, who are sympathetic to the tribal rights or communities. They interpret this law and they've been fighting these struggles. So, how does the encroachment happen? How do we understand that puzzle? There could be multiple answers. We could give an answer from political economy viewpoint. I have some answers, but how would you think about it from the law and development kind of, perspective? That puzzle.
So let's take these three and then we'll go to further questions.
Yeah. So last and your question are linked, and I'll try and answer them. So the first question was about institutions and decision-making behavior, and I know that there is sort of a growing literature on, at least in political science, on decision spaces and that kind of, what is the relationship of norms to decision spaces, institutions to decision spaces, and so on. And there's this whole literature that is kind of political science and Bourdieu and Habitus focused analysis of decision spaces. Okay, and I'm not terribly familiar with that literature. I just have a passing familiarity, so I don't want to say something off the cuff. But what I can say first up is that there is that literature on decision spaces and institutions and norms. But my sense is that the question you ask is slightly more expansive. You're asking how does that translate into development outcomes, right? And that is, in a sense, the question you're asking as well. The literature in the law and development, I think the most interesting literature, to my mind, is the ethnographic cultural literature. So I would say someone like Lawrence Friedman, he doesn't need to study Papua New Guinea, he studies the United States and talks about the relationship between announcement of norms and your capacity to realize them. And what he says is that for about 30 years in the United States, and they're really talking about the segregation, race question, they grappled with this problem that you can announce progressive constitutional amendments and legislations, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but then your capacity in a otherwise functioning and strong legal system to realize these outcomes are extremely difficult. And what does that say then about the promise of law? And the way they close is on a very skeptical note, which is to really say that, and I'll come back to your point as well, which is to say that decision spaces are not only varied across geographies, they're varied across subject matter, and they're varied across time. And so the only kind of careful explanation is the deep investigation of a particular sort of conjuncture. You look at one period of time and you can say something interesting about why, in a theoretical sense even, why a particular area of law cannot be realized or is realized so spottily. I don't see anywhere in the literature a general theoretical way as an academic to deal with law is to take the long view. It may not be 2 generations in every case, the way Kenneth Dam is sure that this is a 2-generation problem. If you if you introduce new norms into old areas of thing, you've just got to wait it out. I'm not that skeptical, because I think there are some areas that we've made better progress, but I don't see any option in a theoretical sense but to layer it in this way, to layer by subject, by geography, and why layer it in that way? Because every site will be a certain combination of formal and informal institutions in the North sense, which is institutions as being rules and other social forms of organization, and that combination is difficult to predict. But all these other spurs, so I'm one of those who who argue that if we increase access to courts, and it gets me to my second question, your second question, which is about the nature of courts, and we have better functioning courts, I think that we change the speed at which these things happen. Not uniformly, but I think generally so. Coming to your question about transaction costs, I don't know about the transaction costs type analysis, but if you're, one of the issues that we are dealing with quite significantly at our research initiative is the delay question, right? And I'm not going to give you a long answer because we are, my colleague Vikas is here. He has poured over this data and thing, and we are not anywhere close to saying something significant and thing. We have made some progress, but I think there are difficult problems on delay. But one of the things that seems to have had a significant effect in other legal systems and might have a chance in India is this variable called outcome date certainty. And when I read it, I thought it was quite innocuous, and it shouldn't be such a strong predictor of the efficacy of a legal system. But apparently, it seems that in legal systems that have transformed from an India situation to a manageable delay pendency situation, the key factor that has changed is not number of judges, amount of budgetary expenses, and this and that and the other. The key factor that has changed is procedural rules that confer outcome date certainty, which means that from your day of filing, you know when the court of first instance will decide your case. It can be 16 months. In the UK, it's still 14 or 16 months away. It's not that it should decide in 2 weeks. But the idea that it will decide in 14 months apparently changes the dynamics of a legal system, because the players in a legal system make other choices and settle the moment there is outcome date certainty. So it seems that one of the potential formulae for resolving the problems we have is to devise an outcome date certainty model in the Indian context. And if you're able to do that, it seems that the cases, though they are filed, they actually never go to trial, like in a Singapore or US or UK system. But if you commit to sending to trial 70 to 80% of your cases, which is what we do, we actually do more than that, we do 90%, then you're sort of condemned to a system of delay. That's what the literature suggests, and it's an idea that we are exploring to see whether it's true of India. Yeah.
So 1, 2, and in a news magazine, whether judges are exceeding their responsibility and becoming judicial activists. So for me, the way I vaguely understand judicial activism, it generally concurs with an idea of a rights-based approach to development. So several sort of lawyers and retired judges had argued against judges exceeding their responsibility, and they were sort of accused of. So even in Karnataka, I think the whole issue of child malnutrition started off with the judges suo motu picking it up, the High Court. So what is the debate among lawyers in the judiciary about judicial act? Drag you back to the Lokayukta. I'm sure you've written a very extensive report and you presented only a couple of sentences. Yeah. So it's unfair, but still, I think the way to look at the efficacy of the Lokayukta, a better method needs to be evolved than merely prosecution, because the Lokayukta has an immense deterrent effect. I've met a number of government officials who very candidly sort of acknowledge that these days the shame of being caught far outweighs the benefits of money. So they do it perhaps more surreptitiously, but we do not have a way, or perhaps you've thought of a way to evaluate future corruption. I don't know really. So that perhaps would be a more fair way to evaluate the role of the Lokayukta. Thank you.
Mine is sort of a comment, and it again links back to your extensive work on Lokayukta that you and Vikas and others have done. And while one is appreciative of rigor that is there in that work, my comment is based on the kind of discourses that we have heard around the Lokpal legislation in waiting and things like that. Somewhere when I follow those discourses, I tend to believe that as citizens and as civil society, there seems to have been totally an oblivion to agencies and constitutional institutions that we have at hand to resolve some of these public finance and accountability issues, namely that of Comptroller and Auditor General of India, which we rise up to when they come out with audit report on 2G spectrum or something like that. But when it comes to Lokpal and Lokayukta and things like that, nowhere we think the function that CAG does as something that could check some of these accountability issues. Why I am bringing this up is that many of the very upfront activists who brought in right to information that has given SICs and CICs powers to summon government officials do not know that CAG Duties, Powers and Conditions of Services Act 1973 doesn't give a constitutional auditor that much authority. I mean, the auditors that went to Uttar Pradesh NRHM audit, and it's there that audit report is public, they have an appendix that lists the kind of records that they asked and the records that they didn't get access to. And irony of ironies is that in 2008, CAG wanted to audit CIC to understand how the RTI Act implementation has been done by CIC. And CIC wrote back to them saying, you don't have authority to audit CIC.
Sorry, two quick questions. Firstly, you mentioned something about tort laws. I don't really know what that is, so could you just say what tort laws are? B, I was just trying to think through about why is it that there was not more literature in the field of law and development that has emerged. And one of the problems was pointed out by Professor Rao, saying that development is probably very limited definition of it by defining it in terms of how economists define it. I'm thinking maybe there's also a problem in how law is defined over here. I mean, should law only be the legal or the normative form of law? I mean, my understanding is interpretation of law probably plays an equivalent role. And I'll just give an example to point out what I mean. One of the failures of the Nehruvian development state to push the agenda was the inability to push through land reforms. And I think there was an important judgment by the Supreme Court about land acquisition in the 70s, which pretty much determined the fate of the development state, because after that it came crashing. So if you look at it that way, in fact, over a long period, many of the major trends or trajectories of development are determined by how the Supreme Court, the courts are interpreting powers or jurisdictions or laws. I mean, in that sense, I mean, if you redefine law and development in that case, I mean, isn't there a larger field opens up for the discipline?
I take that. This question was on judicial activism, and that's something I've not said anything about. Though a few of you asked me about rights-based legal action and whether that is critical for development. So the part that I want to come in on is there's a very big definitional problem, and which you kind of anticipated. You said two things. So judicial activism may be rights-based, but judicial activism is a rubric that covers a range of other things. Let's take one example, the 2G case. Is that judicial activism? By most conventional accounts, and I'm saying what is the conventional account here? A court that goes beyond its traditional basis of jurisdiction is being activist. So I'll just use that. And I think as a lawyer, one can detail and explain why a court in a particular case goes beyond its traditional basis of jurisdiction, because it was an issue that should not have come before the court, or it was a remedy that a court should not have granted. So these are the two kinds of activism that goes on in courts. Is rights-based activism an important ingredient of a development strategy? Is a sort of question that I'll just come to that. So child malnutrition is sort of exhibit A. Unfortunately, the literature on judicial activism in the social sector, on court impact on social variables is even more damning than the law and finance literature. And there is an empirical good literature on the enforcement of socio-economic rights, mainly in South America, with Varun Gauri from the bank has done some interesting work on socio-economic rights in India. And unfortunately, the data is not good. So, which again brings us to the corrective, and Mohan might say that the symbolic effects are important. And I think those symbolic, there's no doubt about that. The Karnataka High Court's intervention on the child malnutrition question at least brings it to the attention of the political bosses of the day, and for whatever reason they marched in and out of court, so they have to think about it at least till 4 o'clock in the evening when they are allowed to leave. So to that extent it has this staging effect, and one might say it has symbolic effects. But the overall sort of social effect of judicial activism in India and elsewhere has been weak. So I don't think that that should be a major strategy. I mean, it should not be, it should not be a solitary strategy. It can't be the main story. So Lokayukta, your question, Vikhar, was that we shouldn't measure conviction rates. We should measure, again, symbolic effects or sort of self-enforcement. Maybe it's more than symbolic effects. We've thought about that. But what we thought then was that we are not into the corruption measurement game. We meaning, at least at APU, we don't have the resources, and we have not. But the other measures of corruption, that is, the corruption measurement is a cottage industry thanks to the bank and Transparency International. Everyone has different measures. But those corruption indicators are rising. So either they're wrong. They may also be wrong. And actually officers are being chastened by the efforts of the Lokayukta. But the data doesn't add up. So yes, Vikas.
In the succeeding years, the number of corruption cases came down. And in the years in which you had more number of senior officials, IAS officials, KPS officials being, charge-sheeted or something like that, the number of corruption cases in the subsequent years came down. But then the data set is too small to make a robust claim. But these are the niche findings. So it seems that the existence of Lokayukta does have impact, symbolic impact, and it transcends across the administration.
But our problem is to capture why filing, what's determining filing rates. What we find is that the strongest indicator of filing rates in the Lokayukta is who's the leader of the Lokayukta, not the number of convictions or the number of prosecutions. So we have to, there's a more complex story that we can't make a strong claim about symbolic effects. It's not clear from the data that is there. So Himanshu's question, Himanshu's comment, I thought was that the CAG and the CIC relationship. So let me say two things. Two things went through my mind as you spoke. The first was that political accountability is a sort of needs a wider assessment of institutions. It's not just the Lokpal, it could be the CAG, it could be the CIC and so on, but also the relationship inter se between these institutions. That's how I understood your comment. My quick reaction was that the way the Lokpal was being designed and proposed, it was being proposed as precisely a sort of an unfettered institution. So in fact what it might well create, I don't know if it will be legislated, might be something like the CIC but much stronger. So it would be an institution that would see itself as being somehow sui generis, different from all others and not subject to the ordinary constitutional constraints. So that was the sort of design that seemed to be advanced. Yes, but you have some.
Services Act. The CAG of India presently, the person who is holding the office, has put in the proposed amendment bill in October 2009. We are talking July 2012. It's a bill that has not seen the table of parliament. It is a bill that is being referred in certain editorials in the Hindu or a few media corners, but largely the civil society groups or the legal fraternity is not.
So I'm not one of those who's
that
seen the
amendment.
bill, so I don't know what this bill does, whether it enhances the powers of the CAG or it diminishes the powers of the CAG. But what I have done is I've read the 2G report. And if the question that Vikhar asks about judicial activism must be asked about statutory authorities like the CAG, it should certainly be asked in the 2G report. For those of you who've had the chance to see it and who have a general sense of the role of the auditor as set up as a statutory authority, there's a very serious question about the role and place of that particular auditor and that particular authority. That's not your question, but I'm just suggesting that while we look at institutional roles and institutional responsibilities, that issue needs to be quite central, that we see that. I don't think that the CAG is in some sense the magic bullet, being this institution that's going to save us all or something like that. I suppose that it's a little more complicated than that. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, the tort law question, the last question was the tort law question. So your point was, what was the tort law reference about? And oh, sorry. Tort law is, deals with non-consensual private obligations, technical definition. That is the range of obligations that we owe each other as in the civil law. That is, for example, I have an obligation not to physically hurt you, right? And if I were to do that, I would give rise to two legal consequences. If I hurt you and hurt you very badly, then it might be grievous hurt under the criminal law. And if I would also give rise to tortious obligations of causing you harm, physical harm. So the tort law in India is dead and buried, because for various historical reasons, the continuity after 1950, just tort law has not survived. And the Bhopal tragedy is the best example of that. If we had effective tort law, Union Carbide would have paid. But we don't have functioning tort law. So that is sort of what is tort law. So a range of tortious liabilities like negligence, nuisance, and there's a whole range, like about 20 torts at one, defamation and so on. Your second question was the Supreme Court decision on property. So should we look at law as just the stated law in the statute? Obviously not. And the law and economics literature is not guilty of that. So they're very careful to look at a range of legal norms, including those pronounced by the courts. So court initiated legal norms are very important. In fact, the law and finance literature credits the legal origin thesis to the role of the courts, because a common law system allows greater freedom to the courts. And they are arguing that that greater freedom to the court to make decisions has resulted in more growth and better. So they don't neglect it. They take that into account fully. Your other question was about the Supreme Court on property. My sense of the history, I didn't know what you meant by the 1970 decision. Generally speaking, the court checked property amendments in the 1950s, but after that, the state has had a reasonable run. It's been allowed the freedom to do what it wants with land reform legislation. So the story of why land reform failed cannot be dropped at the court's door, I think. You'll have to have another account of why land reform has failed.
Okay, so we've passed our time. So if I saw a few hands up, but so maybe we can have one last question, as long as it's a question and not a lecture disguised as a question. So does anyone have one last question that you have? Okay. Vikas.
Internal question.
Internal question.
Yeah.
The discussion that you present about the evolution of law and economics literature, the law and economics literature, see, there's not a structural break between the 1997 and the Kaufman papers. You can keep on increasing countries and add variables. you still will be in the 1997 paradigm. The most important thing that this literature has to reflect upon is that whether cross-country analysis is the right way of studying this. Whether a more localized Clifford-Geertz kind of three-country analysis is better suited and a long-term analysis. Yeah. So you're there on the field for a month or two for many years and then you come. So here what happens, 200 countries, 300 years, and then you come to conclusions which you don't understand.
Yeah. So, so that's a supportive comment. And to the extent that, you know, as lawyers, the way we think about problems is that if you solve one minor rule in a procedural system, you can tackle 30% of a problem. So our inclination, sort of intellectual training and inclination is to think very small. And most people would accuse lawyers of precisely being pedantic. That we're pedantic and we're looking at small letters. And in a sense, that is our intellectual training. Which is why this kind of massive 200 countries, 20 years cross-country comparison along 6 parameters. Each of the 6 parameters have another 7 or 8 or in one case 20 measurements. And then to arrive at a composite index is something that boggles the mind. It is, I mean, for lawyers, the legal mind. That's what I said. I caveated that. So as lawyers, it's a very different form of analysis. We don't do work like that normally. So my sense is that even the work that we are doing on the mediation center, and we're doing a lot of empirical work, what we find is that that small explanation actually has greater explanatory power than the models that we have inherited. But that is a wider sort of intellectual question of how do you compose a problem and what is worth analyzing, you know? So I'm going against the grain of my training and trying to grapple with this literature. So thank you very much for patiently hearing me out.